The Interspatial Military Academy at Kepler 9 represented, depending on who you asked, either the pinnacle of galactic cooperation or the most expensive exercise in controlled chaos ever conceived by sentient beings with more money than survival instinct. Suspended in the comfortable void between three carefully selected star systems, the station rotated gently through space like a very expensive, very fragile monument to the idea that species who'd spent millennia perfecting the art of not killing each other might benefit from learning warfare together. The architects, a consortium of Valorian philosophers who'd never seen combat but had written extensively about its theoretical applications, had designed the academy as a series of concentric rings. Each ring maintained different atmospheric compositions, gravity wells, and temperature zones. The outer rings housed species who breathed methane and considered 400 degrees Kelvin a pleasant spring day. The inner rings accommodated beings who required near vacuum and fed on stellar radiation. Somewhere in the middle, in a zone carefully calculated to offend the least number of physiologies, the bulk of the student body studied the finer points of tactical formation, weapons theory, and strategic planning. The entire system worked beautifully, a testament to bureaucratic precision and the universal desire to prepare for wars that nobody actually wanted to fight. Officer cadets from 247 different species coexisted in relative harmony, learning to coordinate multi-species combat operations that would theoretically only ever be deployed against hypothetical threats during simulation exercises. Then some idiot in the admissions department approved a human. To be fair to the idiot in question, a mid-level administrator named Vex'thor, who'd been processing applications during the final hours of a 36-hour shift. The application had looked legitimate, all the proper diplomatic seals, sponsorship from the Terran Confederacy, medical clearances that claimed the applicant was fully capable of surviving in standard atmospheres. The box marked Deathworld origin had been checked, certainly, but then again, 70% of applicants came from planets where something was trying to kill you. Vex'thor had approved applications from Veltorians, whose homeworld featured acid rain. He'd processed paperwork for Grexians, who'd evolved dodging megafauna that hunted by seismic vibration. How was he supposed to know that Earth was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, a rating typically reserved for planets, where the admission board suggested simply glassing the entire surface from orbit rather than attempting colonization? By the time anyone noticed the error, Corporal Kade Moss had already been issued his uniform, assigned quarters, and completed his first week of orientation. Sending him home would require admitting the mistake, which would require paperwork, which would require explaining to several dozen oversight committees how a human had slipped through screening protocols, specifically designed to prevent exactly this scenario. The decision was made to let him stay. How much trouble could one human cause? The answer, as it turned out, was considerable, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Kade Moss moved through the Academy's corridors with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent 6 months learning that his baseline existence terrified approximately 90% of his fellow cadets. He'd mastered the art of walking slowly, breathing quietly, and occupying as little space as possible, despite standing 2 meters tall and massing 90 kilograms of what the station's medical scanner had described, with barely concealed horror, as dense muscle tissue wrapped around a calcium-reinforced endoskeleton. He'd stopped trying to shake hands after the incident with the Lothian cadet whose manipulator appendage had required 3 weeks in a regeneration tank. He'd learned not to demonstrate proper push-up form after the exercise physiology instructor had calculated the force ratios and promptly requested a medical leave for acute anxiety. He'd even adjusted his diet, eating in his quarters rather than the common mess after realizing that watching a human consume food, any food, but especially protein, triggered instinctive flight responses in species who'd evolved as prey. None of it was enough for Vex'thor Quellin. Vex'thor came from Zentarii Prime, a world that made paradise planets look like industrial wastelands. Low gravity, stable tectonics, an atmosphere so carefully balanced that weather existed as a purely aesthetic phenomenon. The Zentarii had evolved in an environment so consistently pleasant that their primary evolutionary pressure had been competing with each other for social status. They developed crystalline bone structures that diffracted light beautifully, skin that shifted through pastel hues based on emotional state, and a culture built entirely around elaborate displays of aesthetic superiority. They had not, notably, developed any particular capacity for violence. Zentarii combat was a ritualized affair involving carefully choreographed movements, light touches to specific body points, and dramatic poses that demonstrated flexibility and grace. Matches were judged on form, artistic expression, and the elegance of one's declaration of victory. Actual injury was considered appallingly barbaric, the kind of thing that happened to species who hadn't evolved properly. Vex'thor had been raised in the noble houses, trained by masters who'd perfected the art of ceremonial combat over 15,000 years of recorded history. He'd won the Grand Celestial Tournament 3 years running. He'd been accepted to the Academy based on his tactical simulations and his family's generous donations. And he'd arrived expecting to be recognized as the obvious apex of military potential. Then he met the human. His first encounter with Kade had been in strategic planning, where the professor, a Grexian with 6 doctorate degrees and a nervous disposition, had assigned species-mixed tactical groups. Vex'thor had been paired with Kade, a Ytharian navigator, and 2 Plentox engineers. The assignment was straightforward: plan an orbital insertion against a fortified position. Kade had suggested a direct approach. Drop from high orbit, use atmospheric friction as cover, deploy during the target's night cycle. Vex'thor had designed something beautiful: a 3-stage feint, elaborate signal deceptions, forces positioned in aesthetically pleasing formations that would look stunning in the after-action reports. The professor had run both simulations. Kade's team, 78% success rate, minimal casualties, objective secured in 14 minutes. Vex'thor's team, 31% success rate, catastrophic casualties, mission failure after 3 hours when the beautiful formations had proven remarkably easy to target. The professor had praised Kade's brutal efficiency, while critiquing Vex'thor's over-reliance on aesthetic considerations in combat scenarios that reward function over form. Vex'thor's skin had shifted through 17 shades of humiliated purple. It had gone downhill from there. Every simulation, every tactical exercise, every scenario that required actual combat thinking rather than theatrical performance, Kade excelled. Not because he was brilliant, he was the first to admit he was average by human standards, but because he came from a world where efficiency in violence had been the price of survival for 300,000 years of evolutionary history. Vex'thor's resentment crystallized into active hatred around the 6th week of the semester. Kade had, politely, suggested that Vex'thor's approach to close-quarters combat training might benefit from less spinning and more punching. The Zentarii had taken this as a mortal insult, which it wasn't, and a challenge to his entire cultural heritage, which it also wasn't. But Vex'thor heard it as both. The Zentarii noble began a campaign of petty sabotage. Kade's simulation equipment developed mysterious malfunctions. His tactical proposals were accidentally deleted from group projects. His schedule was altered to place him in training scenarios specifically designed to highlight the limitations of bipedal locomotion. Kade, who'd grown up in the orphan factories of Europa Station and had endured significantly worse than administrative harassment, largely ignored it. This, predictably, made Vex'thor even angrier. The situation reached critical mass during a routine tactical simulation in the Academy's main concourse, a massive open space where students gathered between classes. The exercise involved coordinated movement through a virtual hostile environment, with each team's performance displayed on holographic screens for the entire student body to observe. Vex'thor's team had gone first. Their performance had been technically adequate, though their insistence on moving in aesthetically pleasing patterns had cost them 12 minutes and resulted in 40% simulated casualties. Kade's team went second. They'd completed the same scenario in 4 minutes with 0 casualties, using an approach that Kade's Ytharian teammate later described as horrifyingly direct. When the scores appeared, Vex'thor stood in the center of the concourse, his crystalline structure refracting the station's artificial light in patterns that signified absolute fury. Around him, 300 cadets from 24 species watched with the universal student body's instinct for impending drama. Kade had been attempting to leave quietly, which was his default approach to most situations. He'd nearly made it to the corridor exit when Vex'thor's voice, amplified by the acoustics of his crystalline physiology, echoed across the concourse. "Primitive." Kade stopped. Around the concourse, conversation died. "Excuse me." Kade's voice was quiet, which several of the more perceptive xenobiology students recognized as a warning sign among predator species. Vex'thor strode forward, his movements the elaborate gliding steps of Zentarii formal challenge. His skin shifted through aggressive crimsons and oranges. "You heard me, Deathworlder. Primitive, brutish, lacking any sense of form or elegance. You charge through scenarios like fauna, all instinct and no intelligence." Kade turned slowly. "Vex'thor, I don't want problems with you. Because you know you're inferior." Vex'thor was committed now, playing to the crowd, which had grown silent with the anticipatory hush of witnesses to something they'd discussed for years. "You succeed through violence because you're incapable of strategy. Your people haven't evolved past throwing rocks and grunting." "My people," Kade said, his voice still quiet, still careful, "put a man on our moon, using the computing power of a calculator. We've colonized 6 star systems. We've made first contact with 47 species, and we've never fired the first shot. How noble!" Vex'thor practically sang the words, his formal challenge posture now complete. "The predator claims peaceful intent. Shall we test that claim? Vex'thor, you don't want to do this. I challenge you to ceremonial combat. Traditional rules. First touch to 3 points wins. Unless..." Vex'thor's skin rippled with condescending blues. "You're afraid?" Around the concourse, students shifted uneasily. Several species, who understood human body language, were quietly moving toward the exits. A Grexian professor, who'd been observing from the upper gallery, was frantically accessing the station's communication system. Kade's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid. I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" "Your legendary human violence." Vex'thor laughed, the crystalline sound echoing off the walls. "I've studied your species' combat footage. Clumsy. Unrefined. You lack the grace for true martial prowess." "That footage," Kade said slowly, "was us holding back." "Then don't." Vex'thor spread his arms in the opening stance of Zentarii formal combat, a position that would have looked stunning in any artistic composition. "Show me what a Deathworlder can do when he stops pretending to be civilized." Kade stood very still. Several meters away, his Yetherian teammate was making urgent cutting motions across his throat, the universal gesture for abort, abort, abort. "I'm not going to fight you, Vex'thor." "Then you admit inferiority." Vex'thor glided closer, his movements the product of 15,000 years of choreographed tradition. "You admit that humans are nothing but fauna with delusions of sentience." "I admit," Kade said, his patience finally fracturing, "that you're an arrogant jackass who's about to learn a very painful lesson about physics." Vex'thor's skin flashed through outraged purples. In Zentarii culture, such language demanded immediate response. He closed the remaining distance between them, moving with the flowing grace of his people's combat forms, and delivered what was, by his species' standards, a devastating strike. He slapped Kade across the face. To be precise, he extended his arm in an aesthetically perfect arc, rotated his wrist at exactly the prescribed angle, and made contact with Kade's cheek using the flat of his palm. The blow contained approximately 0.3 newtons of force, which would have been sufficient to score a point in any Zentarii combat arena. Kade's head moved approximately 1 centimeter. Vex'thor, committed to his follow-through form, held the pose. The concourse was absolutely silent. Then Kade flinched. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was 300,000 years of evolutionary reflexes, coded into the human nervous system when Earth's hominids were still learning that large predators considered them food. It was the same autonomic response that caused humans to blink at loud noises, to pull back from heat, to react to perceived threats with immediate, overwhelming force. Kade's arm moved in a tight, efficient arc, his fist, 90 kilograms of human mass and muscle behind it, traveling at approximately 8 meters per second, impacted Vex'thor's crystalline facial structure with roughly 2,400 newtons of force. The sound was remarkable. 17 witnesses would later describe it independently, using variations of like a chandelier falling into a tile floor. It echoed across the concourse with a clarity that bypassed conscious thought and connected directly to the instinctive part of the brain that recognized the sound of structural failure. Vex'thor's head snapped back at an angle that defied his species' normal range of motion. His crystalline bone structure, which had evolved to diffract light beautifully and had never been designed to withstand kinetic impact, fractured in 17 distinct places. His aesthetic facial planes shattered into geometric fragments. His carefully cultivated features collapsed inward with the geometric certainty of failed architecture. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, his elaborate combat form forgotten, his skin flashing through rapid, uncontrolled color shifts that signified catastrophic neurological trauma. Kade stood over him, his fists still clenched, his expression transitioning rapidly from surprise to horror. "Oh," he said quietly. "Oh no." The station's emergency medical response team materialized with the speed of professionals who'd spent the last 6 months preparing for exactly this scenario. They'd run drills. They'd updated protocols. They'd had long, anxious discussions in the medical bay about what to do when, not if, the human injured someone. The head of emergency response, a Veltarian named Crix, whose species had evolved on a high-gravity world, and thus had some concept of kinetic force, took one look at Vex'thor's collapsed facial structure and activated the station-wide emergency channel. Medical emergency, main concourse, initiate containment protocol 7. We need xenosurgery, structural reconstruction, and someone get the human sedated before he panics and breaks something else. "I'm not going to break anything," Kade said, his voice hollow. "Is he alive?" "Barely." Crix was scanning Vex'thor with instruments that were making alarm sounds. "His entire facial structure is compromised. We've got crystalline fragments in his cranial cavity. His optical receptors are damaged. This is bad." "He hit me first," Kade said, which was true but seemed inadequate to the moment. "He hit you with about as much force as a light breeze," Crix snapped. "You hit him with a calculated strike that would have killed most species in this academy." "It wasn't calculated. It was a flinch." "Your flinches involve 2,000 newtons of force?" "Yes." Kade looked genuinely confused. "That was me pulling the punch." The concourse, which had been frozen in shock, erupted into panicked motion. Students scattered toward the exits. Professors activated emergency lockdown procedures. 3 species with particularly sensitive prey instincts fainted, which created secondary medical emergencies. The medical team loaded Vex'thor onto an emergency transport, his shattered form secured with restraints designed for structural instability. Crix pointed at Kade with one manipulator appendage. "You, come with us, don't touch anything, don't move quickly, don't breathe hard." "I'm breathing normally," Kade protested. "Your normally is terrifying. Just follow us, and try not to accidentally kill anyone else." The medical bay at Kepler 9 had been designed to handle the medical needs of 247 different species, which meant it was equipped with everything from regeneration tanks to molecular resequencers to prayer chambers for species whose biology included a verified spiritual component. It was staffed by the best xenosurgeons in the known galaxy. Individuals who'd spent decades learning how to keep beings alive when their physiologies had nothing in common except carbon-based biochemistry. None of them had ever tried to reconstruct a Zentarii's shattered face after it had been punched by a human. The surgical theater filled rapidly with specialists, each staring at the holographic displays showing Vex'thor's injuries with the expression of professionals confronting something that should be theoretically impossible. Dr. Melnix, the head xenosurgeon, was a Tytharian who'd successfully reattached limbs, regrown organs, and once reconstructed an entire plentox after a catastrophic pressure failure. She stared at Vex'thor's scans and said very quietly, "This is ridiculous." "Agreed," said her assistant, a Lothian named Prex. The force required to create this damage pattern would require industrial equipment. It was one punch, Crick said from the observation gallery. One reflexive human punch. Show me the footage. They pulled up the security recordings. The surgical team watched in silence as the scene played out. Vex'thor's elaborate approach, the formal slap, Kade's minimal reaction, then the punch. Melnyx ran the footage back, slowed it down, analyzed the biomechanics. He rotates from the hips, uses his entire body mass. The arm is just the delivery system. Look at the leg drive. That's a trained combat response, Prex observed. No, Kade said from the corner, where he'd been sitting very still and trying to become invisible. That's how humans punch. All of us. We're taught this as children. The surgical team turned to stare at him. You're taught to generate this much force. Melnyx's voice was carefully neutral. We're taught proper form so we don't hurt ourselves, Kade corrected. The force is just what happens when you punch correctly. What happens when you punch incorrectly? You break your hand. On what? Whatever you're hitting. Prex made a note on his datapad. The human species regularly generates sufficient force to cause self-injury when striking objects. I mean, yeah, Kade shifted uncomfortably. That's why we have the whole don't punch walls thing. You have to be told not to punch walls? Some of us do. The surgical team exchanged looks that communicated several doctoral theses worth of concern. Melnyx turned back to the displays. Right. We can reconstruct the facial structure using cellular scaffolding and crystalline regrowth. It'll take weeks. Prex, begin fabricating the support structures. Crix, get me his genetic baseline from the Zentarii medical database. Everyone else, start reviewing cross-species reconstruction protocols because we're about to improvise extensively. The surgery lasted 11 hours. They rebuilt Vex'thor's face piece by piece, using a combination of cellular regeneration, crystalline growth matrices, and some techniques that Melnyx invented on the spot and would later publish in the Galactic Journal of Emergency Medicine under the title Reconstructive Protocols. Following catastrophic kinetic trauma, a case study. Kade sat in the observation gallery the entire time, refusing offers of food, water, or sedation. He watched every procedure, his expression caught between guilt and fascination. I didn't mean to, he said at one point to Crix, who'd stayed with him out of some mixture of professional duty and concern that leaving the human unsupervised might lead to additional catastrophe. I know, Crix said. That's what makes this so problematic. I could have killed him. Yes. With a reflex. Yes. One that I can't control. That, Crick said carefully, is the central issue. While the surgical team fought to save Vex'thor's face, the administrative apparatus of the Academy activated protocols that had been theoretical until approximately 11 hours ago. Department heads convened emergency meetings. The legal team accessed precedents from 3 different legal systems. The diplomatic corps began drafting very careful messages to the Zentarii homeworld. The security footage was analyzed by 17 different specialists, each reaching the same conclusion. By every legal and ethical standard that applied to the Academy, Kade had acted in self-defense. Vex'thor had issued a challenge, refused multiple attempts at de-escalation, and initiated physical contact. The fact that his attack had been about as threatening as a particularly aggressive handshake was, legally speaking, irrelevant. The fact that Kade's response had been disproportionate to an almost comical degree was, ethically speaking, extremely relevant. The Academy's commandant, an ancient Grexian named Thex, who'd been in charge during the station's construction and had seen every possible variety of cadet stupidity, sat in his office reviewing the footage for the 47th time. Idiots, he muttered, both of them. The Zentarii for starting it, the human for not understanding his own capacity for violence. His assistant, who'd been taking notes, cleared his throat. Sir, what do we do? Do? We've already done it. We let a human into the Academy. Everything else is just consequences. The Zentarii diplomatic corps, predictably, lost their minds. The initial transmission was 30 minutes of formal outrage, delivered in the elaborate verbal patterns that Zentarii culture had perfected over millennia. It demanded justice, reparations, the immediate expulsion of the human, and strongly implied that the entire academy should be dissolved for allowing such barbarism. The human embassy's response was considerably shorter: "Your boy hit first." This did not improve diplomatic relations. A compromise was eventually reached, mostly because Vex'thor regained consciousness after 72 hours and provided his own testimony. He admitted, with considerable reluctance and skin patterns that signified extreme embarrassment, that he had initiated the confrontation. He had issued the challenge. He had made physical contact first. He just assumed that physical contact between civilized species operated under Zentarii rules, where combat was an elaborate dance and actual injury was impossible. He'd learned otherwise. The Academy's final ruling took 2 weeks to draft and involved input from legal scholars across 4 sectors. Kade was cleared of any intentional wrongdoing, but assigned to mandatory courses in cross-species physical interaction protocols and managing Deathworld reflexes in civilian environments. Vex'thor, once his face had been reconstructed, was charged with initiating unauthorized combat, failure to follow de-escalation protocols, and, somewhat cruelly, gross miscalculation of force dynamics. Both cadets received formal reprimands in their permanent records. The Academy implemented new policies. Physical contact between species with significantly different mass and strength profiles was now forbidden outside supervised training environments. Deathworld origin cadets were required to attend additional safety briefings. Several species formally requested that humans be restricted to specific areas of the station, which the administration denied but privately considered. The student body, as student bodies do everywhere, ignored the official response and created its own social restructuring. Kade became simultaneously legendary and slightly terrifying. Cadets would point him out to visiting parents. Stories about the punch grew with each retelling, acquiring details that hadn't happened and dramatic flourishes that defied physics. Vex'thor, surprisingly, became Kade's most vocal defender. 6 months after the incident, they were paired again in strategic planning. The professor, still nervous, had assigned them to different teams, but Vex'thor requested the transfer. "I want to work with the human," he'd said. The professor had stared. "Are you certain?" "I've learned something important." Vex'thor's reconstructed face, which the surgeons had done remarkable work on, remained carefully neutral. "I've learned that what my people call combat is artistic expression. What his people call reflexes is what the rest of the galaxy calls warfare." They'd been paired. Their tactical simulation involved a 3-way engagement between numerically superior forces. Kade suggested a direct assault. Vex'thor designed a beautiful deception that would position enemies exactly where Kade's direct assault would do maximum damage. The professor had run the simulation. Success rate: 94%. Casualties: minimal. Objective secured in 8 minutes. The professor had stared at the results. "How did you make this work?" Vex'thor's skin had shifted through pleased blues. "I provided the elegance. He provided the violence. Turns out you need both." Their team had scored highest in the class. News of the incident spread beyond the academy through the intricate networks that connected military institutions across the galaxy. It became a case study in xenopsychology courses, a cautionary tale in diplomatic training, and a viral sensation on the galactic information networks under titles like "Deathworld Casually Destroys Noble in One Punch" and "Why You Don't Slap Humans." The broader implications took longer to manifest. Military planners across multiple species began reevaluating their assumptions about human combat potential. Diplomatic protocols were updated to include warnings about initiating physical contact with Deathworld species. Several planets quietly upgraded their threat assessments of the human race from emerging space power to approach with considerable caution. The Zentarii, to their credit, took the lesson seriously. Their military academy updated its curriculum to include realistic force dynamics and removed several thousand years of artistic tradition from their combat training. It was a painful cultural adjustment, but as one Zentarii, General put it, better to abandon aesthetics than to discover, during actual warfare, that our elaborate forms are militarily useless. The humans, for their part, took the incident as confirmation of what they'd already suspected. They needed to be very, very careful. The Terran Confederacy updated its training protocols for citizens serving in mixed-species environments. New courses appeared in military and diplomatic training, managing your Deathworld heritage in civilized society, understanding that your normal is terrifying, and the particularly popular "Please Stop Accidentally Injuring Aliens." Kade graduated in the academy 3 years later, ranked in the top 15% of his class. He specialized in mixed-species tactical coordination, and went on to serve with distinction in the Interspatial Defense Forces, where his ability to combine human directness with Zentarii strategic elegance proved remarkably effective. Vex'thor graduated in the top 5%. He specialized in strategic planning and developed a reputation for tactical designs that looked beautiful and worked perfectly, a combination that had been considered impossible before someone punched him hard enough to shatter his face and his assumptions about how the universe worked. They stayed in contact, exchanging messages across the expanding network of space stations and colony worlds. Their friendship became minor legend itself, proof that even the most catastrophic first impressions could lead to mutual understanding, assuming everyone survived the initial contact. The Interspatial Military Academy at Kepler-9 continued to train officer cadets from hundreds of species, teaching them to coordinate in warfare that they hoped would remain theoretical. The concourse where Vex'thor had challenged Kade became informally known as the Punch, and new students were always told the story during orientation, usually with considerable embellishment. The core lesson remained: the galaxy was filled with species of vastly different capabilities, and the line between ignorance and catastrophe was often measured in fractions of a second and thousands of newtons of force. Also, more practically, if someone from a death world says they don't want to fight you, believe them. They're not being modest. They're trying to save your life. Years later, when Kade had achieved the rank of commander and was giving a lecture to new cadets on cross-species combat coordination, a young Zentarii officer raised his hand. "Sir, is it true that you once killed a cadet with a single punch?" "I didn't kill anyone," Kade corrected. "I shattered his face and required a team of surgeons to reconstruct it over 11 hours, but he survived." "That's almost worse." "Sir, that's exactly what my therapist says." The lecture hall erupted in nervous laughter, the universal sound of students, realizing that the authority figure at the front of the room might be slightly unhinged. Kade smiled, which several of the more perceptive cadets recognized as his predator expression, the one that showed too many teeth. "The incident taught me 3 important lessons," he continued. "First, your instincts can be dangerous to others even when you mean no harm. Second, understanding your own capabilities is as important as understanding your enemies. Third, and most importantly, if someone whose species evolved dodging large predators tells you to back off, listen to them. They're not being dramatic. They're giving you information that might save your life." He paused, his expression serious now. "The galaxy is big. It's strange. It's full of species who see the universe completely differently than you do. Some of us come from worlds where everything is trying to kill us. Some of you come from worlds where violence is an abstract concept. Neither perspective is wrong, but pretending the differences don't exist is how people get hurt." In the back row, a senior officer watched the lecture with quiet approval. Vex'thor, now an instructor himself, made notes on his datapad. Later, he'd integrate some of Kade's points into his own strategic planning course, continuing the collaboration that had begun with a catastrophic misunderstanding and evolved into something resembling wisdom. The Interspatial Military Academy at Kepler-9 rotated through space, training the next generation of officers, teaching them to coordinate across impossible differences, and occasionally, very occasionally, demonstrating through memorable catastrophe exactly why those differences mattered. Somewhere in the medical bay, the reconstructive protocols developed during Vex'thor's surgery were being updated into the standard curriculum. ensuring that future generations of xenosurgeons would be prepared for the particular challenges of treating injuries caused by species who considered violence a reflex rather than a choice. And in the main concourse, where new cadets gathered between classes, a small plaque had been installed near the spot where Vex'thor had fallen. It read, in 12 different languages, "Here, Cadet Vex'thor Quellin learned that ceremonial combat and actual violence are not the same thing. May all who pass this spot remember, understanding differences prevents disasters." Below that, in smaller text that someone had added unofficially, and that the administration kept threatening to remove but never quite got around to it. Also, don't slap Deathworlders. Seriously. Just don't. The galaxy spun on, filled with species learning to coexist, occasionally through gentle diplomacy and careful cultural exchange, and occasionally through the hard physics of kinetic impact and the expensive process of reconstructive surgery. Either way, lessons were learned, usually the hard way, always memorably,